Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, the show where we report bitter pills of truth that people don't want to swallow and the corporate media typically doesn't want you to know exist. So today I want to talk about a little unfortunate controversy, a little spat between two progressive independent media commentators who I both really like what they do, generally speaking, and have followed them for a while. Niko House and of MCSC Network, and Jordan Chariton of Status Coup. And to an extent, Niko's partners at MCSC Network. And basically, what this is about is reporting on election fraud related to the 2020 elections. And the issue is this. Of course, as you have probably heard, Donald Trump and his supporters have pushed the narrative that the Democrats, or that Joe Biden, won the 2020 election because the Democrats rigged the election. And there have been a few progressive commentators, not most, but some, who've basically backed that same claim, and or at least said it seems likely that Biden won because the Democrats rigged the election. Now, as I reported on this show the other day, it's at this point a pretty wide margin between Biden and Trump. I mean, that's a close election, but a 3.5% margin, more than 5 million votes, is pretty difficult to. It's pretty difficult to account for as an instance of election fraud, given that the polls were all reporting that Biden was going to win by a lot more than that. So the Real Clear Politics polling average coming into the election had Biden winning by 7.2%. And as you can see, he apparently won by about 3.5%. And anyway, let me just talk about what the spat was about between Jordan and Niko. So Niko claims that the Democrats cheated in the election to get Biden elected. And prior to the election, as I mentioned the other day, he and some others were predicting that Trump was going to win the election, which I think was a very plausible prediction back before COVID hit, and the Democrats were engaged in a pretty specious effort to impeach Trump over charges that were relatively minor regarding supposed blackmail of the Ukrainian government to get them to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. That really there's not very good evidence was true, and even if it were, it pales in comparison to some of Trump's other crimes, such as militarily occupying Syria's oil fields, as I've discussed before in the show. So anyway, Niko and some others among progressive media commentators supported the idea that the election results occurred because the Democrats cheated. And on the other hand, Jordan Chariton of Status Coup, another left-leaning independent media commentator, said he was very skeptical of claims that there was any systematic or widespread rigging of the election on the part of the Democrats. And note that he didn't say that he was absolutely convinced that there was no rigging on the part of the Democrats, but just said he had yet to see evidence of it, and if anyone had evidence of it, he'd be happy to look at it. And so a lot of name calling started. So Jordan, who supports the narrative that there's no evidence thus far that Democrats cheated in order to get Biden elected, but Democrats have cheated in the past in primaries to prevent Bernie Sanders from winning the nomination, for example, and Jordan has actually reported on that. But on the other hand, there's clear and consistent evidence that actually, if anyone rigged the results of this election or attempted to, it was the Republicans who have for a long time suppressed the votes through various means involving knocking people off the registration lists of people who are likely Democratic voters, people of color, poor people, and younger people. So, for instance, voter ID laws in some states prohibit people from using a student ID, which is a state-issued ID, as a means of identification for purposes of voter registration. So, off the rolls they go. Or it's claimed that people have changed their address, and when in fact they had moved. And this was used by Brian Kemp in Georgia when he was running for governor, but was Secretary of State in charge of Georgia's elections, to knock 200,000 people off the voter registration lists in Georgia. And that sort of stuff has continued since then, despite efforts by some, like Greg Palast, investigative reporter who's done some great work on election fraud, to try and get those people re-registered or let them know that their registration had been revoked. Anyway, so because Niko was promoting what Jordan regarded as kind of a conspiracy theory, he called Niko a grifter. No, Niko is a grifter who routinely pushes conspiracy bullshit. No interest in entertaining his latest nonsense. Niko, for his part, said Jordan was all about reporting on election fraud during the primary when he could use it to pretend as if he was fighting for Bernie to win. Now election fraud is absolutely impossible. Not that he's looked into it in any way, but grifters gotta grift. So, first of all, I just want to say, chill the fuck out, guys. Neither of you is a grifter as far as I can tell. I think that Niko has done some excellent reporting and investigative work. He broke the story on election rigging in North Carolina when he was a chair of the University of North Carolina Sanders campaign, I guess student club. I'm not sure what it was, but in that capacity, he was reporting on election fraud back then. Jordan has also reported on election fraud in 2016, in 2020, and so forth. They've both done some excellent journalism. I don't think there's any sign at this point that either of them is a grifter. So, I hope this doesn't continue. Fiorella from Convo Couch also criticized Jordan, saying, "Yikes, I expected more from ND media. Making election integrity a partisan issue is dangerous. Questioning our elections, which have long been fraudulent, is not conspiratorial. For years, many have covered the issue. Funny how people who never have are suddenly experts on this." And that's in response to Jordan saying, full report on so-called progressives pushing President Trump's fact-free election theft conspiracy theory. And, he did a video on that where, I believe he mentioned Niko by name and called him a grifter. As for what Fiorella said here, look, Jordan's not making election integrity a partisan issue, and he has been covering the issue in the past. as far back as 2016, and reported on election fraud or election rigging, whatever you want to call it, on the part of both parties. So he's not making it a partisan issue. Anyway, another thing that Jordan said, not related to this controversy, but related to the general issue of the correspondence between polls and voting outcomes. He said the polling industry needs to be overhauled. In Democratic primaries, polls wildly underrepresented Bernie Sanders' support by oversampling older voters. To Nate Silver of 538.com is full of it in response to Silver's article. The polls weren't great, but that's pretty normal. Well, whether polls can be overhauled so that they will be bang on in predicting the outcome of every single election is a possibility that, there's a number of reasons why it's very difficult for that to happen. For one thing, polls take place up until, a couple of days before the election, but they don't take place on election day. So things can change during that time frame. Another issue is that it's hard to reach people on the phone these days because there's so much telemarketing and bill collecting and so forth. So they do their best to tailor their sample to the demographic characteristics of the population as indicated by the census, but they're getting a very low response rate. So it's a pretty difficult task to predict with 100% accuracy. Now, these polls this year were off by about 3.5% on average, which is a little bigger than normal. Normally, the average of polls taken prior to presidential elections is to be within about 1 or 2% of the outcome. So, for example, in 2016, they missed. They accurately predicted that Hillary Clinton was going to win the popular vote, didn't accurately predict who was going to win the electoral vote. They missed a couple of states, but they were within 1% of the popular vote difference between Clinton and Trump that actually occurred. And in 2012, I believe it was about a 3% miss, and it was much more accurate than that in other elections this century. And in contrast to that, the exit polls, which are a much bigger sample and are taken of people after they have actually voted or think they voted because they might have cast a provisional ballot that didn't get counted, they were spot on this election. So they don't report the overall results, but we can extrapolate pretty easily when we look at and you can see almost 16,000 people were sampled, which is an enormously larger sample than pre-election polls, which are typically the high hundreds to low thousands in terms of sample size. But we can look at male and female results here and extrapolate to the overall sample. So as you can see, 8% more males voted for Trump than for Biden, or reported that they had. 15% more females reported voting for Biden than for Trump. So, you can combine those two together, and it's about 3.5% prediction that Biden would win by maybe a little over 3.5%. And as you can see, that's almost exactly how the popular vote has turned out. So, an issue that I have with the reporting on this election by Fiorella and Niko, ironically, is that they have only looked at one side of the equation in terms of election integrity. They have looked into possible election rigging on the part of the Democrats, but they haven't done so on the part of the Republicans. So That's a bit strange. Because we know that both parties routinely cheated in elections. Why should we assume that? Why should we assume? Well, I don't know about assume, but why should we ignore the possibility that the Republicans cheated this election? And just because Biden won, the Republicans still might have tried to rig the election in Trump's favor. We shouldn't overlook that possibility. And in fact, Jordan Chariton just had on Greg Palast of the investigative reporter who's probably done the most journalism of anybody about election integrity issues over the years. And basically, he, in fact, first reported on this issue back in the 2000 election when he disclosed that Republicans in the state of Florida had disenfranchised tens of thousands of mostly black voters by fraudulently claiming that they were felons, which in Florida, at least at that time, if you had a felony conviction, you couldn't vote. And thereby rigged Florida and the entire election for George Bush. And he's been reporting on it ever since then. He reported on, for example, the enormous election rigging scandal in Georgia in 2018 when Brian Kemp, now the governor of Georgia, masterminded the disenfranchisement of a couple of 100,000, mostly black voters who overwhelmingly are likely to vote Democrat if they vote. Reported also on rigging in the 2016 election, the rigging of the Democratic primary in California this year, and so forth. So he's done a lot of work on it. And anyway, Jordan from Status Coup interviewed him, and basically, he's looked at this pretty closely, and his conclusion was at this point, the main election fraud came from Trump. Well, I mean, not necessarily from Trump, but from Republicans who supported Trump, based on things like efforts to knock people off of the voter rolls in places like Wisconsin and Georgia, based on fraudulent claims that they had moved or changed their address, and therefore their registration was invalid, which technically you can't just knock people off the voter rolls just because your address has changed, and you have to notify them if you're going to remove them from the registration list, which they didn't do. And conversely, at this point, Greg Palast's conclusion is that there hasn't been solid evidence of election rigging on the part of the Democrats in the general election. Not that they're not capable of it, because of course they do it all the time in the primaries, but they didn't really have to in the general election because Trump so royally screwed up his response to the COVID pandemic, and also turned a lot of people off with his response to the protests of police violence that took place during the summer. And he's been a very unpopular president anyway. He has a very enthusiastic core of supporters, but his approval ratings have never been above 50% that I can recall, and typically are in the low 40s, and that was the case prior to this election. And Biden was consistently leading in the polls by like 7 or 8%, 6 to up to 10% the entire year. So I think that the Democratic Party leaders were completely confident that Biden was going to win. And the rigging that did occur was mainly through the corporate media coverage of the election. Or on the part of people supporting Biden, the corporate media coverage, which most of the corporate media that supports Democrats, was very, very skewed. So scandals that related to Joe Biden were swept under the rug. They smeared Tara Reade and other women who accused Joe Biden of various sorts of sexual misconduct. They actively censored stories about Hunter Biden's corrupt business dealings and connections, as far as that's concerned, with Joe Biden. Glenn Greenwald, formerly of The Intercept, resigned his position with The Intercept, and he's the co-founder of The Intercept. But he resigned his job with The Intercept because they refused to publish a story that he wrote looking at Hunter Biden's emails and other evidence of corrupt business dealings with Ukraine. And social media also censored stories about that. So, yeah, there was plenty of rigging by folks who supported Joe Biden in this election, but so far the evidence suggests that rigging took place mainly in terms of the way that the election was covered. And conversely, there is very solid evidence, as Greg Palast reported on in this interview, that the Republicans have continued their nefarious ways of trying to prevent people who are likely to support Democrats from voting. Black and brown people, poor people, young people, etc. And as Greg Palast also reported, the Democrats actually do that too. Target the exact same group of voters because those are the people most likely to support progressive challengers in the Democratic primaries. And of course, there's a possibility that that can carry over to the general election, ironically, and hurt Democratic candidates, along with the damage inflicted on Democratic candidates' chances by Republicans' efforts to kick people off the registration list and so forth. So again, there's cheating on both sides. At this point, doesn't mean we can rule it out, but at this point, the evidence doesn't seem strong that Democrats rigged the general election for Joe Biden, or that they really needed to. And if anything, Biden might have won by more, were it not for people who were disenfranchised and couldn't get their registration back in time to vote. So again, I hope that this controversy subsides and we don't have people who genuinely have progressive ideals, attacking each other like this. It really isn't helpful. Okay, that's all I have to say about this. See you next time on The Bitter Pill.